I want to say, for the record, that I recommended against it. That is not a comfortable thing to admit. Vethori cartographers do not recommend against things. We document. We measure. We place coordinates on charts and we record what was there when we arrived and what was there when we left. And if those two things differ, we note the nature of the difference in neutral language and we file the observation. That is the job. The job does not include sitting in a shuttle bay at 12,000 units of altitude, watching 6 of the summit core finest begin to come apart against a ridge system, and writing in the margin of your official report, "I told them so." I did not write that. I am writing it now in this account, which is not an official report and which I am producing because the Survey Bureau's adjudicator asked me, in the flat, exhausted way of someone who has read a great many incident reports and is hoping to find, somewhere in this one, a sentence that makes sense of the outcome. She asked me to produce a first-person account of the Harren's Reach neutralization attempt, beginning from the assignment briefing and ending with the extraction, in sufficient detail to explain the final casualty figures. The final casualty figures are as follows: 6 Summit Core operatives dispatched, 1 extracted alive, 5 confirmed dead by exposure and terrain-related trauma, though I note that by the time of the adjudicator's report 2 of those 5 had been reclassified from deceased to severely incapacitated, a distinction the adjudicator said was meaningful for the record even if it was not reassuring in practice. 0 confirmed dead by hostile action, no weapons discharged by the target, no physical altercation with the target, no communication from the target beyond what she volunteered, unprompted, when she judged it relevant. The adjudicator looked at that line, 0 by hostile action, and then she looked at me, and I saw in her expression the specific kind of confusion that a bureaucrat develops when the paperwork does not fit any of the forms she has available. I understood the confusion. I had been sitting with it for 11 days, trying to fill out forms that were designed for different outcomes than the one I had witnessed. This is my attempt to explain it. The briefing was conducted in a room with no windows on the lower orbital deck of the Vethori Territorial Authority's administrative station above Harren's system. I was not supposed to be in that briefing. Cartographers attend briefings concerning terrain mapping operations, survey corrections, and disputed boundary demarcations. They do not attend briefings for Summit Core neutralization assignments. I was in that briefing because Commander Vis had specifically requested a cartographer, and because I was the only one currently assigned to Harren's system, and because my superior informed me I had no legitimate grounds to decline. Commander Vis was a large creature, even by Vethori standards. The Summit Core selects for cold tolerance physiology. They run broader across the chest, thicker in the neck, with subcutaneous fat reserves that make their faces look slightly swollen in normal atmospheric pressure. It is an adaptation shaped over many generations of high-altitude operations on worlds that would kill a standard Vethori trooper in under an hour. Vis had the particular kind of stillness that comes from years of operating in environments where unnecessary movement costs calories you cannot spare. She stood at the head of the briefing table, and she looked at the terrain maps I had provided, and she said very little for a long time, reading each notation with the deliberate attention of someone who has learned to distrust maps that were made by people who were not there in person. The other 5 were seated around the table. I did not know their names then. I would learn them over the following 6 days, in the order in which they became relevant to my mission log. What I knew from the briefing was this. Harren's Reach is a ridge system on the northern continent of the 4th body in the Harren system, a Class 19 designation by the Vethori Territorial Authority's own environmental hazard scale. The Class 19 designation exists for 4 reasons. First, the atmosphere is technically breathable by oxygen-dependent species, but only just the partial pressure of oxygen at sea level is sufficient. At altitude, It drops to margins that most oxygen-dependent species cannot sustain without supplemental equipment. Second, the ridge system sits at a mean elevation of 9,400 units above the northern continent's baseline, which places it well inside the altitude band, where supplemental oxygen becomes non-optional for the majority of species in the galactic conclave's biological registry. Third, the thermal cycling on Harren's northern continent is violent. Daytime surface temperatures on the ridge can reach positive 40 units Celsius in direct sun. Nighttime drops to negative 60 are not uncommon. The swing happens in approximately 4 hours, which is fast enough that an unprepared party caught in it during an exposed traverse will not have time to make shelter. 4. The ridge system itself is geologically active in ways that make the terrain unpredictable at the scale of individual route selection. Rock faces that were stable when we mapped them 6 months ago may not be stable now. Cornices form and collapse. Ice bridges appear and vanish. The cartographer's map of Harren's Reach is always, to some degree, a map of what was there, not what is there. The Vethori Territorial Authority classified Harren's Reach as unsurvivable for standard operations in the year 7440, one of the conclave reckoning, following the loss of a 16-member survey team during an early territorial mapping expedition. The surviving 3 members of that team were extracted after 11 days. Their reports formed the primary source material for the Class 19 designation. 2 of the 3 survivors required prolonged medical recovery. One never returned to field work. The ridge has not been operationally occupied by Vethori personnel since, which is not a policy exactly, but which has the functional weight of one. This is why it was surprising, to put it mildly, when long-range passive sensors in the Harren system detected a life sign on the ridge approximately 14 months prior to the briefing. The life sign was singular. It was stable. It was not distress-coded. It moved along the ridge at irregular intervals in ways consistent with deliberate survey work rather than random drift or distress wandering. The sensors could distinguish between these patterns because distress wandering has a characteristic irregularity that reflects cognitive impairment, while deliberate survey movement has a methodical quality, a regularity in stops and starts, a pattern of returning to previous positions and then extending further. This life sign was doing the second thing. It had been doing the second thing without apparent interruption for as long as the sensors had been logging it. It was accompanied by a low-power transmitter signal on a Colonial Survey Bureau frequency. The Colonial Survey Bureau is a human organization. It surveys territories on behalf of what humans call the Colonial Expansion Authority, which is the administrative body that manages the expansion of human settlements beyond their home system and its immediate neighbors. Harren's system sat in a region of contested territorial designation, not contested in the sense of active dispute, but contested in the sense that the Vethori Territorial Authority had claimed it on paper 30 years ago and had not since done anything with it. And the Colonial Survey Bureau had apparently decided that a claim without occupation was an invitation to look closer. The life sign on the ridge was human, female based on the thermal profile, operating alone, had been on the ridge by the time the briefing occurred for approximately 11 months. Commander Viss pulled up the thermal profile on the display, and we all looked at it for a moment. The signature was small. It moved efficiently. It did not display the irregular, hesitation-heavy movement patterns that Vethori survival researchers associate with an entity in distress or operating at the edge of its tolerances. It moved like something that was not particularly concerned about where it was, which was the detail that I kept returning to when I reviewed the orbital logs before the briefing. An entity at the edge of its tolerances moves differently. It hesitates. It doubles back. It lingers in places that offer shelter beyond what the route requires. This entity did not do those things. It moved like it was taking a walk it had taken before. One of the troopers at the table, I would later learn her name was Sen, said that the atmospheric margin at that altitude was insufficient for human function, and that the Colonial Bureau must have misidentified the signal. I said, carefully, that the Colonial Bureau's Biological Registry for Human Physiology listed their altitude operational ceiling as considerably higher than previously assessed, and that there had been updated documentation circulated through the Conclave's Scientific Exchange Program in the last decade. I said I could provide the relevant citations. Commander Viss looked at me. She had very pale eyes, pale even for Vethori, and the particular quality of attention that senior Summit Corps personnel develop, the kind that makes you feel that she is calculating something behind the look, and that the calculation is about you specifically and what use you are. She said, "The citations are noted." She did not ask for them, I did not press, we moved on. The mission objective was straightforward. The human surveyor was operating in Vethori-claimed territory without a transit permit, without a landing authorization, and without a diplomatic notification, which in aggregate constituted a territorial violation under conclave law. The Vethori Territorial Authority's response to territorial violations of this kind was, technically, the issuance of a cease and desist order via conclave diplomatic channels, followed by a formal extraction request, followed by arbitration if the request was declined. Viss did not mention any of those steps. What she outlined was a direct approach. 6 Summit Corps operatives plus 1 attached cartographer would descend to the ridge system via drop shuttle, locate the human, and escort her off Harren's reach by whatever means were necessary. Whatever means were necessary was a phrase I had encountered in Vethori Authority language before. It was a phrase that did certain work. It left the precise nature of the means unspecified in the formal log, while communicating clearly enough to everyone in the room what the range of those means might include. I said I would need to file an updated terrain survey before any approach. Viss said I would do that from the extraction shuttle during the operation. I noted that operating from the shuttle meant I would not be on the ridge surface, which meant my survey data would be remote sensor only, and would have the limitations that remote sensor data always has on geologically active terrain. Viss said that was acceptable. I understood, sitting there, that I was not expected to contribute anything except my existing maps and my official presence, which would allow the operation to be logged as a properly staffed survey and enforcement action rather than a direct interception. I was the paperwork. I had been invited to be the paperwork. I went back to my bunk after the briefing, and I looked at my maps of Harren's reach for a long time. I looked at the thermal profile of the human surveyor, and I counted the months she had been up there, and I looked at the Class 19 designation, and the 7,441 casualty report, and the footnote about the 3 survivors. Then I looked at the orbital imaging from the past 14 months, showing a single thermal signature, moving steadily along a ridge system, that had killed 16 Vethori surveyors in 11 days. 11 months. She had been up there for 11 months, and the ridge had not killed her, and I was going to be the cartographer attached to a unit going up to tell her to leave. I did not sleep well. We dropped at local dawn. The shuttle was a military descent vehicle, hard angles, efficient, no concessions to comfort, and I sat in the rear observation bay behind the troopers with my mapping console and my passive sensor array, and I tried to be invisible in the way that attached personnel learn to be invisible around operational units that do not want them there. The troopers were as prepared as I have ever seen a unit be. Summit Corps standard kit for Class 18 and above. Supplemental oxygen on integrated chest rigs, not tanks but membrane diffusers that filtered and concentrated ambient oxygen to manageable partial pressures. Thermal regulation suits under armored outer layers, rated to -70. Climbing equipment that was frankly more sophisticated than anything I had ever seen, magnetic grapples and micro-thread anchors and footwear with dynamic grip surfaces that adjusted to substrate hardness in real time. This had also brought 2 portable atmospheric processors, emergency oxygenation, units roughly the size of a large pack that could create a breathable microenvironment around 2 to 3 individuals in a pinch. She had brought them as contingency, she said in the briefing, emergency equipment. The kind of thing a careful commander brings when the mission plan accounts for everything, and she still wants to be prepared for what the plan does not account for. I noted all of this because I am a cartographer and noting things is what I do, but also because I was aware that this level of preparation was the preparation of people who believed they were going somewhere that required it. And the human surveyor was up there with none of it, or at least, with none that showed on the sensor readouts, which logged her kit as a standard Colonial Survey Bureau field pack, approximately 45 kilograms, no supplemental oxygen system, no thermal suit rated beyond -35. Sen made a comment about this during the descent. She said the target's equipment loadout was inconsistent with sustained operations at the designated altitude, and that she suspected we would find a base camp at lower elevation, with the thermal signature representing day trips to the ridge. Vis looked at the 14 months of orbital tracking data and said nothing. The tracking data was unambiguous about one thing. The signature had not spent a night below 9,000 units of elevation in the entire monitoring period. If there was a base camp, it was on the ridge. The shuttle set down in a high valley approximately 2 kilometers below the main ridge line, which was as close as the pilot was willing to commit the vehicle given the thermal cycling and the unpredictable wind shear at higher elevations. We would have to climb. Vis had planned for this. She briefed the 2-kilometer approach in the shuttle bay while the pilot ran pre-ground diagnostics, and she did it with the efficiency of someone who had climbed harder ground than this, or who believed she had. I would not be climbing. I would remain with the shuttle and conduct my remote survey while the team worked the ridge, which was the arrangement we had agreed on and which I was, I will admit, grateful for, because I am a cartographer and not a climber, and because the valley floor, even sheltered from the ridge wind, was cold enough that the moisture in the corners of my eyes was crystallizing uncomfortably. The valley was beautiful in the way that Harren's northern continent is often beautiful, which is to say, it was vast and pale and quietly committed to killing anything in it. The sky above the ridgeline was a particular shade of blue that does not exist at lower altitudes, a stripped-down blue, a blue with everything unnecessary removed from it. The wind, even sheltered in the valley, had an edge to it. I could hear it in the gaps between the shuttle's hull panels creaking as the temperature differential worked on the metal. Vis led the team out at 3:40 local. I watched them go from the shuttle door, 6 shapes in summit core white, moving in single file up the valley floor toward the base of the ridge approach. They moved well. I cannot take that away from them. They moved like people who knew cold ground, like people for whom this kind of morning was ordinary, and watching them I thought that if the human surveyor was what the sensors said she was, alone, under-equipped, 11 months into a Class 19 environment, then Vis and her 5 were more than sufficient. I thought that the operation would be over in a day, perhaps 2. I went back inside, set up my console and began my remote survey. I should explain what the passive sensors could and could not show me. What they could show me: thermal signatures to a resolution of approximately half a unit at close range, degrading to 3 units at the distances I was working at. Movement vectors, approximate mass, atmospheric readings from the sensor drones I had pushed up to the ridge line before the team deployed, which gave me wind, temperature, pressure, and precipitation probability in real time. What they could not show me: faces, expressions, the specific physical details of what was happening at any given moment. I was watching colored shapes move across terrain, cross-referenced with topographic data, and I was interpolating the story of those shapes from everything else I knew. I became very good at that interpolation over the following 6 days. By the end, I could read the team's emotional state from their movement patterns with a reliability that was not scientific, and that I noted in my private log but not my official report. The first indicator came at approximately the 3-hour mark. The team had reached the base of the main ridge approach, a rock-and-ice face of roughly 800 units of vertical gain, which is not trivial but which Vis had rated as within Summit Core standard capability. She had it logged in the mission plan as a 2 to 3 hour climb. They were making reasonable progress. I was watching their 6 thermal signatures move upward in good formation, staggered, with Vis at point. The 7th thermal signature appeared at the top of the face, on a broad shelf of ice that the mapping data called the upper approach platform. It had been there, according to my sensor logs, for approximately 40 minutes before the team reached the base. It was simply there, stationary, at a temperature consistent with a resting metabolic state, not cold enough to suggest hypothermia, not elevated enough to suggest fear or exertion, just resting. At the top of an 800-unit ice face in -40 ambient, with nothing around it that my sensors could identify as a heated enclosure or a wind shelter of significance. I watched the team climb. I watched the 7th signature sit on the shelf above them. Occasionally it moved a short distance, 3 or 4 units, and then settled again. At one point it appeared to be doing something with its hands in the area of its torso, which I later interpreted as adjusting equipment or preparing food. The thermal bloom around the hands was consistent with handling warm material, which suggested a stove. She was making something hot to eat or drink. On the upper approach platform, in -40 in the wind. When the team reached the top of the face, they made it in 2 hours 40 minutes, which was good time by any measure, and which told me they were motivated and fit. The 7th signature was approximately 15 units away from where they crested, seated on a flat rock, doing something I could not identify. I had not known what to expect from this encounter. I had spent the 3 hours of the climb composing possibilities. I had imagined distress, a survey worker who had gotten in over her head and who would be genuinely grateful for the approach of anyone, whatever the circumstances. I had imagined aggression, some form of resistance, a weapon, a defensive position. I had imagined the procedural friction of a jurisdictional dispute, demands for documentation, refusals to comply with an authority she did not recognize. I had imagined a combination of these things in various proportions. What the sensors showed me was approximately this. The team crested the ridge, spread into a semicircle, and approached the 7th signature. The 7th signature did not move. The team's movement rates and spacing indicated a cautious, deliberate approach, the spacing of people preparing for resistance. When they were approximately 5 units from the signature, the team stopped. There was a period of roughly 4 minutes where neither group moved in any meaningful way. The team appeared to be in communication among themselves. I could see the micro-adjustments of posture that indicate speech. Then there was an exchange that I logged as communication between the team and the 7th signature, based on the fact that the 7th signature's posture also changed in the small ways associated with speaking. The exchange lasted approximately 12 minutes. At the end of it, the human's thermal signature was still resting on the flat rock, in the same general position, and Vis's team had spread slightly wider, not closer. Not a cautious spread. Something else. The kind of spread that occurs when people have been expecting something and received a different thing instead and are redistributing their attention in response. My communication panel chimed. It was Vis, on the encrypted mission frequency. She said, "The surveyor has been informed of the violation and the requirement to vacate. She has declined and indicated that her survey authorization is under Colonial Bureau protocols that preempt Vethori territorial claims under Section 14 of the Conclave Disputed Territories Act. She has provided a document reference number." I said, "Is the document reference valid?" A pause, a specific kind of pause that Summit Core personnel produce when the answer to a question is not the answer they want to give. Then Vis said, "It is being evaluated." I asked if the team needed me to pull the relevant legal documentation from the Conclave registry. Vis said no. She said to stand by. The channel closed. I pulled the documentation anyway privately and began reading it. The team remained on the upper approach platform for another 6 hours. During that time, the human signature moved twice, once in a direction I interpreted as toward the far edge of the platform, where my sensor drones showed a section of geological formation she appeared to be sampling, and once back to approximately the same flat rock. Both times the team's signatures tracked her movement but did not close the distance meaningfully. They maintained a consistent perimeter. They were watching her. She appeared to be working. At approximately 1700 local, as the temperature began its 4-hour drop toward the nighttime nadir, the team began setting up camp. The human signature on my sensors was about 22 units away. It appeared from the thermal profile, from the specific pattern of the thermal bloom around her position, that she was also setting up a bivouac. Not a heated tent, not an atmospheric enclosure. A bivouac, a sleeping bag on the open rock. I messaged Vis and asked for a status update. She replied, "Camp, reassessing approach in the morning." I wrote in my private log, "The human is sleeping outside in the open at this elevation at -42 and dropping." Then I did not know what else to write, so I stopped writing. The second day is when things began to change. I do not mean that anything dramatic happened on the second day. Nothing dramatic happened on the second day. What happened was quieter than dramatic, and in its quiet way considerably more instructive. Vis had planned to resume the approach early. The mission log shows a 600 departure from camp for the next section of the ridge, a traverse across a section called, on my map, the Broken Shelf, because the geological survey from 18 months ago had shown it to be an ice shelf with subsurface fracture lines that made its stability uncertain. The shelf stretched approximately 200 units across a section where there was no alternative route. The eastern face was a sheer drop, and the western face was a corniced edge that the recent wind loading had made unreliable. The Broken Shelf was the only way across this section of the ridge, and I had flagged it in my pre-mission terrain notes, with the specific recommendation that it required point reconnaissance before the full team committed. The Broken Shelf was how the first trooper died. I should say, after the adjudicator's reclassification, how the first trooper was catastrophically injured. The distinction matters legally. I am told it matters to his family. I will try to honor it. His name was Oreth Kellen. He was the team's senior ice technician. He had operated on Class 18 and Class 19 terrain before. I read his service record while the team made their first day camp, because I was looking for anything that would help me understand what was coming. His record was genuinely impressive. He went across the Broken Shelf on point, probing as he went with a standard ice lance, and for the first 40 units the probing found solid ice above the subsurface fracture lines. At Unit 43, the probe broke through into a void. Kellen had read the probe correctly and stopped. He tested to the left. He tested to the right. He found what appeared to be solid ice 2 units to the right and moved onto it. The shelf collapsed under him into a subsurface cavity approximately 8 units deep, and the collapse took a section roughly 6 units wide. He dropped out of my sensor view for the 4 seconds it took for him to fall to the cavity floor, and then he appeared again as a thermal signature 4 meters below the surface, at an angle that, combined with the mass distribution data from the sensor, suggested he had landed badly. The team's response was immediate and practiced. They roped down to him within minutes. He was alive. His suit telemetry, I could see the aggregate read on my console, indicated a lower limb fracture, complex and head trauma. He was not going to walk out on his own. What I want to note, because it is the thing I keep returning to, is what happened in the 3 minutes before the team moved to the rope. The sensors showed the team stopping at the collapse edge, assessing. The sensors also showed the human signature, which had been moving at a distance of roughly 30 units behind the team. She had been tracking their pace, staying back, not closing stop at the same moment the shelf collapsed. She had felt the concussion through the ice or heard it or both. Then her signature moved forward, not toward the collapse, but to the left, along an arc that bypassed the collapsed section entirely. The signature paused at a point on the far side of the collapse, on stable ground. I logged the position. It was approximately 15 units to the left of the team's current approach line. When Vis's team had secured Kellen and were assessing their options for moving him, the cavity was too deep to climb out of without assistance. The angle was wrong. The rope geometry was complicated. The channel opened. Vis's voice was controlled and flat in the way of someone maintaining control deliberately with effort. She said, "Kellen is non-ambulatory. We need extraction at the broken shelf." I said I was already working on it. I said I needed 20 minutes to get the shuttle repositioned to an approach that the wind conditions would allow. I asked if there was a clearing suitable for drop extraction within reach. Vis described the terrain around the collapse, and I cross-referenced it with my maps, and I confirmed there was a workable zone about 100 units back from the edge, provided the wind stayed under 15 units per second. Then on the same channel, a different voice. Not Vis, quieter, a rougher quality to the transmission, like the signal was passing through the cliff geometry and being bounced a few times on the way. The voice belonged to a woman, clearly, and the cadence was flat and practical in a way that I have since learned to recognize as a characteristic of Colonial Survey Bureau field personnel, people who spend a great deal of time alone and have learned to deliver information without the social preamble that most species use to soften an exchange. The voice said, "If you come off the shelf to the left, there's a rock line that's stable. The ice looked questionable there when I came through, so I went around it. The approach to your extraction zone is cleaner that way. I'd go about 15 units left of your current position before you start moving him." A long silence on the channel. Vis said, "Who is on this frequency?" The voice said, "I'm on the same frequency you've been using since the first day. You didn't change the band after our first conversation. I've been monitoring." Another silence. Vis said, "The extraction approach is a Vethori Authority operational matter." The voice said, "Yes, you're moving a person with a broken leg across an ice shelf that I had concerns about. I'm telling you the route I took. Do what you want with it." A pause, then, "The ice is solid to the left. I marked the line when I came through 3 weeks ago. You'll see a small cairn on the approach." The channel was quiet for a moment. I could see, on my sensors, the small indicators of the team's movement as they conferred. Then Vis gave a route instruction to her team. The instruction went 15 units to the left before traversing. They found the cairn. I could not see it on my sensors, but I saw the team's movement pattern change in the way it changes when people locate a navigational marker, a brief consolidation, a shift in direction, a more confident resumption. They did not lose anyone else getting Kellen to the extraction zone. I brought the shuttle in at maximum approach angle, and we got him aboard. His injuries were severe but survivable. The medical unit would tell me later the outcome was substantially better than it might have been, because the cavity floor had a layer of compacted snow that absorbed some of the impact. He was the first person off the mountain. From a certain angle, from the angle I began to develop on day 2, he was the lucky one. I should describe, as clearly as I can, what the next 4 days were. I should describe it because the adjudicator's report will categorize it under terrain casualties and equipment failure, and those categories are accurate and also insufficient. They do not capture what I watched from my console, which was the slow, methodical disassembly of one of the Vethori territorial authorities' most capable high-altitude units, by a ridge system that one human woman had been navigating alone for 11 months. It was not that she did anything to them. I want to be precise about this because it is the line the adjudicator found most difficult to process. I reviewed the sensor log 6 times. I am confident in the statement. She did not obstruct, trap, sabotage, or physically impede any member of the Summit Core team at any point during the operation. She did not use any weapon. She did not remove or damage their equipment. She did not cut any rope, collapse any anchor, or reroute any path in a way that directed them into danger. With 2 exceptions, both of which were forms of assistance, she did nothing to them at all. What she did was exist on the ridge, navigate it the way she had learned over 11 months, and occasionally, when it seemed to her relevant, say something on the open frequency that the team could do with as they chose. Day 3. Trooper Mevest was crossing a wind-loaded slope above the team's second camp when she triggered a slab release. A section of wind-compressed snow approximately 40 units wide and 20 deep had loaded against a rocky feature above the trail during the previous night's wind event. The slab moved. Mevest went with its 60 units before her arrest device caught and held. She was alive. She had a dislocated shoulder, 3 cracked ribs, and a thermal suit shredded on the rock field at the bottom of the slope. The suit was no longer rated for the temperatures they were operating in. The night temperature was going to be -54. They called me for extraction. I said I could get to within 400 units by shuttle but not closer. The wind shear on the approach was outside the pilot's safety threshold for a descent, and I was not going to ask her to exceed it. The 400-unit gap was over technical terrain that Mevest, with a dislocated shoulder and cracked ribs and a compromised suit, could not cross. The human's voice came on the frequency. She said, "There's a serac on the east side of that rocky feature. You can get below it and into the wind shadow. The shadow will run 15 to 20 degrees warmer than ambient through the night. I've used it when the wind came up suddenly. The rock on the east face is stable down to the base. Hand-placed anchors will hold. She can wait there until the wind drops enough for your shuttle." This, on the channel, was quiet for a moment longer than it had to be for the evaluation she was performing. Then she told 2 of her remaining troopers to get Mevest to the serac. The temperature in the wind shadow that night was -31. It was enough. Mevest survived. In the morning, I brought the shuttle to the closest safe approach, and we short-hauled her out on a long line. She had severe bruising and early-stage hypothermia and would not climb again that season. She was the 3rd person off the mountain. She was alive, and the knowledge that the human had pointed them to the serac, without being asked, without any apparent calculation about whether it served her interests, was a fact I turned over during the return flight and did not reach any satisfactory conclusion about. That left Vis, a trooper named Korath, and a trooper named Sen, and the human, who was now roughly 25 units ahead of them on the ridge and who had, I noted, not paused her survey work in any detectable way during either the Kellen extraction or the Mevest incident. Her movement pattern showed the methodical, stop-start rhythm of a working surveyor. She had been watching, I was sure of that. Her position in both cases put her in a location where she could observe the team's situation. But watching, for her, apparently, was something that did not require stopping work. Day 4 was Korath. I do not know how to write about Korath in a way that the adjudicator's report will find useful, because what happened to Korath was not a dramatic failure. It was the accumulation of good decisions made with insufficient information on terrain that did not forgive insufficient information. Korath was the team's navigation specialist. He was responsible for route finding on technical sections where the mapping data was ambiguous. On the 4th day, Vis assigned him to find a route across a section of ridge that my maps showed as passable, but that the recent freeze-thaw cycle had changed in ways my remote sensors could not fully resolve. He worked the section for 2 hours, which is a serious commitment of time and physical cost at that altitude. He made a decision about a line. The decision was understandable based on the information he had. He was not wrong about the line. He was wrong about the timing. The section he chose was stable in the morning cold. In the afternoon, when the sun caught the south face, the surface ice began to melt away from the underlying rock. The rock was smooth and sloped, and had nothing for crampons to bite once the bonding layer was gone. He was moving across it when he felt the change. He went off the rock. The rope held Vis had placed a solid anchor above. He swung into the face, and the impact, shoulder first, then head, left him concussed and unable to coordinate. He hung on the rope for 40 minutes while Vis, who was anchored above and could not descend to him without abandoning her anchor and coming off herself, assessed options. At the 15-minute mark, the human's voice came on the frequency. She said she could see Korath's position from her location. She said, "He needs to get his feet on the rock to the left of where he's hanging. There's a ledge there about knee height. If he can get his feet on it, he can unweight the rope enough for you to shift the anchor." Vis said, "He can't coordinate." "The impact," the human said, "then talk him through it. Tell him to move his right foot 6 units to the left. He doesn't need to understand the instruction. He just needs to move his foot." Vis talked Korath's right foot 6 units to the left. It took 14 minutes, and she had to repeat the instruction 11 times in various forms. I was monitoring the channel and I counted them, because I was doing something with my hands while I watched the sensor data, and counting things was the thing available. His foot found the ledge on the 12th attempt. He unweighted the rope, fractionally, and Vis moved the anchor and brought him in. He was not able to continue. He was not able to descend under his own power. The extraction of Korath was the most complicated shuttle operation of the mission, and I will not describe it in full here because the pilot's report covers it adequately. We got him down with a long line in wind that was marginally outside the safe parameter envelope, and the pilot did not sleep for 2 days afterward. Korath lost 2 fingers to frostbite and suffered a moderate traumatic brain injury that would require months of recovery. He was the 4th person off the mountain. He was alive. Vis and Sen remained on the ridge. The human was roughly 26 units ahead of them and had, on my sensors, not altered her working pace. Day 5 was quiet. I mean that in the most literal sense. Nothing happened that resulted in an extraction or a casualty or a significant equipment failure. Vis and Sen moved along the ridge at a pace that was slower than the first day and slower than the second. I noted in my log that their thermal signatures showed the elevated metabolic output of people running on reserve. The body's response when caloric intake is no longer keeping up with caloric expenditure, and it begins pulling from deeper stores. High-altitude cold does this faster than most environments. Vis's kit had been provisioned for 8 days. They were on day 5. The arithmetic was not comfortable. The human moved along the ridge. She stopped to take readings in the methodical way she had stopped every day I had been watching her. The equipment I could resolve on my sensors, geological sampling probe, ground-penetrating array, was the instrumentation of someone conducting a thorough, professional survey. She had come to do a specific job and she was doing it, and she would be done when the job was done and not before. On day 5, I also did something I should probably have done earlier. I pulled the Colonial Survey Bureau's public registry and looked up the survey authorization that the human had cited to Vis on the first day. It was real. Section 14 of the Conclave Disputed Territories Act does provide a mechanism by which member state citizens can conduct survey operations in claimed but unoccupied territories under Colonial Bureau auspices, provided they file proper notification. The notification is supposed to go to the Vethori Territorial Authority. I searched the authority's inbound filing system with the document reference number Vis had given me. The notification had been filed 14 months ago, 11 days before the first sensor detection of the human's life sign on the ridge. It had been received. assigned a tracking number, and routed to the Office of Territorial Administration. The office had apparently decided that a human filing a survey authorization for a Class 19 Deathworld was so implausible that it must be an error, and they had placed it in a pending review queue where it had sat, unreviewed, for 14 months. I read this twice, then I read it a third time, then I sat with it for a while. Then I opened a separate document and began drafting what would eventually become a private note to the adjudicator, separate from my official report, outlining the documentation chain and its implications for the operation's legal standing. The adjudicator later told me this note was extremely helpful. She said it in the tone of someone for whom the word helpful is doing a great deal of work, and who does not have a stronger word available that would be appropriate in a formal context. Day 6. Vis called me at 4:12 local, still full dark on the ridge, and her voice was different. She was still controlled, same flat cadence, same deliberate pacing. But there was something underneath it that had not been there on day 1. The sound of a person who has been running a calculation for 5 days and has finally arrived at an answer she did not want. She said, "The target is not surveyable by direct enforcement. I have 2 operatives on station, one of whom sustained a cold injury yesterday that I did not report because it was within tolerance, and the ridge ahead requires 3 more days of technical climbing to reach the survey completion point. My team is depleted. Equipment is at 53% rated capacity. Both atmospheric processors are showing degraded performance." I said, "What would you like me to do, Commander?" She said, "I would like you to tell me something useful about the terrain on the next section." I told her what I had. I told her about the next 3 kilometers of ridge as well as my remote sensors could describe it, which was not as well as I would have liked. I told her about a section of knife-edge ridge that my data suggested was stable, but that I could not confirm. The angle and the recent thermal cycling made me uncertain. I told her about a couloir on the eastern face that my historical data showed as avalanche-prone in the late afternoon. I told her about a section of approach ice that the sensor drones were showing as heavily loaded from the previous night's wind, which could mean nothing or could mean a slab waiting for the right weight. I told her everything I knew, and I told her, clearly, what I did not know, which was more than I was comfortable with. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And the target?" I looked at my sensor display. The human's thermal signature was stationary, on my map, at a point approximately 26 units ahead and slightly above their current position. The metabolic temperature was consistent with sleep. The mass distribution was consistent with a sleeping bag configuration. The ambient temperature around her position was -48. I said, "Asleep." Vis said, "What is her equipment status?" I said, "I cannot assess her equipment status from here in meaningful detail. Her pack mass has decreased from my initial estimate by approximately 12 kilograms, which is consistent with 6 days of consuming food and fuel. She has her standard Colonial Bureau field kit. She has no supplemental oxygen system on my readings at any point during the mission. She has been on this ridge for 11 months. A long silence. Vis said, "How?" It was not a question, exactly. It had the form of a question but not the inflection. It was the specific utterance that occurs when a person has been watching something happen for days and cannot make it fit any model they possess, and has arrived at the point where they are simply stating the incomprehension aloud. I said, "She grew up on Harren's Deep. It's a Class 19 candidate world. The Colonial Survey Bureau had it flagged for designation upgrade assessment when she was a child. The atmospheric partial pressure on Harren's Deep at habitable altitude is not substantially different from what you're breathing on this ridge. She has been breathing air like this since she was old enough to breathe." Another silence, longer than the others. Vis said, "Her oxygen tolerance," I said, "is not supplemented because it does not need to be supplemented. Not for her. Her physiology calibrated to it." I heard something on the channel that might have been breath or might have been wind on the microphone. Then Vis said, "And the cold." I said, "Harren's deep averages -28 in its temperate band. The colonists there run metabolic and physiological profiles that the Colonial Survey Bureau's medical registry describes as significantly outside standard human baseline for cold tolerance. They do not have a precise number for how far outside." Vis said, "Because." I said, "Because nobody tested it systematically. Because prior to the conclave contact period, the Colonial Bureau was not in the habit of measuring the extremity of human physiological variance on colony worlds. There are a great many colony worlds, and measuring the adaptation range of each population was not considered urgent. And since contact, the priority assigned to that research has apparently not matched the scientific interest." I thought about what I was saying as I said it. I thought about the Class 19 designation and the 16 Vethori surveyors in 7441 and the 3 who came back and the report they filed, and I thought about what a human organization reading that report might have concluded. A ridgeline that killed 16 Vethori surveyors in 11 days, on a world whose atmospheric and thermal profile is comparable to a world where some humans are born and grow up and learn to walk and breathe and sleep outside in the dark. I said, "Commander, I found the survey notification in the authorities' filing system. It was received and placed in pending review without being processed. She has a legal authorization to be on this ridge." The silence after that was different from the other silences. It had a different weight to it, a weight that was not just surprise but something more like resolution, the feeling of a thing becoming inevitable. Vis said, "I am aware." I said, "What do you intend?" She said, "We are going to continue to the survey completion point. We are going to document the completion of our enforcement approach for the mission record. And then we are going to request a voluntary departure, and if it is declined, file for conclave arbitration on the territorial question." I said, "That is what the original protocol called for." She said, "Yes." Neither of us said anything else. The channel closed. Outside my console window, the ridge was invisible in the dark, and the sensor display showed 2 summit core signatures and 1 human signature and the dark between them. They did not make it to the survey completion point. They made it to within 900 units of it. On the morning of day 7, crossing the knife edge section I had warned Vis about, Sen's crampon anchor failed. Not the crampon itself, a micro-thread anchor she had placed to protect the traverse across the narrowest section. The anchor had been placed in rock that had a surface crack running through it, a crack that my sensors had not resolved, and that was not visible to the eye at operating light levels in the early morning. When she weighted the anchor on her descent traverse, the section of rock with the crack separated from the face. She fell 12 units before the next anchor in the chain took the load. The next anchor held. She was shaken but not critically injured. She was, however, 12 units below the traverse, hanging on a rope, and the traverse above her was a knife edge with no protection because the only usable anchor point on it had just separated from the rock face. The human's voice came on the frequency. She said she could see the knife edge from her position and that she could see where Sen was hanging. She said, "There is an anchor point on the west face, about 2 units below the crest line. It is in basalt. The crack system runs east-west, so the west face is clean. You can trust a placement there." Vis said, "Can you reach it from where you are?" It was not quite a question either. Nothing Vis said in those last 2 days was quite a question, because the weight of what she had been observing had done something to her inflection that I noticed, but did not have clinical language for. The human said, "I could get to you in about 20 minutes. A pause. Vis said, "I'm not asking you to assist a Vethori authority enforcement operation." The human said, "I know what you're doing. I'm asking if you want me to help." A longer pause. the length of a very specific kind of calculation. Vis said, yes. I watched the human's thermal signature move. It moved fast, faster than the team had been moving for days, faster than I had seen her move in 6 days of observation. It traversed back along a line that I had not identified as a viable route on my maps, dropped down a short section of rock, and came up to the knife edge from below and to the west. 23 minutes. She placed the anchor. She belayed Sen up from below, and I could see from the rope geometry on my sensors that she was doing this one-handed equivalent, braced, without any indication of strain in her movement profile. She handed the rope to Vis and stepped back. I logged all of this. I logged the timing. I logged the route she took, which was not on my maps, and I updated the map. After Sen was on the ridge and moving, there was a brief exchange between Vis and the human that I could not fully parse from the sensor data, 2 thermal signatures, close together, relatively still. It lasted about 4 minutes. I could see from the posture data that both were speaking, though whether at length or in brief I could not determine. Then Vis's signature began moving back east along the ridge. Sen followed. The human's signature remained at the knife edge for a few more minutes, and then turned and moved west, resuming the direction she had been moving when they arrived. Vis called me at 11:40. She said, "We are withdrawing. File the mission log as terrain-limited approach, inconclusive enforcement. We are filing for conclave arbitration on the territorial question." I said, "Understood." She said, "The conclave arbitration will take approximately 18 months, and it will find against us. The notification was valid and properly submitted. She has been operating legally on this ridge for 14 months, and we have no grounds for enforcement." I said, "I expect that is correct." She said, "Get us off this mountain." Sen lasted one more day. Not because of anything catastrophic. Because she had been running on reserve for 4 days and the cold injury Vis had not reported on day 5 had progressed in her feet when we examined them in the shuttle, had tissue damage consistent with moderate frostbite on 3 toes of the right foot and 2 of the left. She needed medical attention. She got it. She will recover, the station's medical team said, with time and care and the specific kind of patience that frostbite recovery requires. She was the 5th person off the mountain. Vis came off the ridge on day 8 last, alone, because that is the summit core protocol when there are no subordinates left, and that is who Vis was, someone for whom protocol and self were not distinct things. She walked into the shuttle bay and stood there for a moment in the way people stand when they have just come in from somewhere that required everything from them, and the ordinary air of an enclosed space is still registering as strange. She was still controlled, but she was thinner, visibly, in the way that high-altitude cold takes from a body with uncompromising efficiency over 8 days, and there was something in her face that I did not have a clinical word for. I sat with her in the shuttle bay while the pilot ran the ascent pre-checks. I asked if she wanted anything. She said no. We sat in silence for a while. Then she said, "She offered me tea on the first day." I said I had not known that. Vis said, "When we crested the ridge and approached her position." She was sitting on the flat rock and she had a camp stove burning and there was a pot of something on it. She asked if we had come far. She offered tea. A pause. I declined. I said, "She made tea at 12,000 units of altitude on a Class 19 Deathworld." Vis said, "She appeared to find the altitude unremarkable." I said nothing to that. There was nothing to say to that that would not sound either redundant or absurd. The shuttle lifted. Below us on the sensors I could see 1 thermal signature on the ridge, moving west at a steady pace. No hesitation in the movement. No alteration from the pattern I had been observing for 8 days. The movement of something that knew exactly where it was, on ground it had chosen, doing the work it had come to do. The last thing I want to record, because the adjudicator asked specifically, and because I think it matters to the accuracy of the overall account, is the notation I found when I pulled the Colonial Survey Bureau's transmitted field report, which the human had been broadcasting continuously on the low-power survey frequency throughout her 11-month operation, and which the authority's intelligence section had apparently been monitoring and not translating. Because the conclave's scientific exchange bandwidth allocation for Survey Bureau transmission protocols was considered low priority, which is the kind of institutional decision that seems reasonable until the consequences of it are sitting in front of you in an adjudicator's office. The report covered 11 months of detailed geological, atmospheric, and biological survey data for Harren's Reach and the surrounding ridge system. It was thorough in the way that Survey Bureau reports are thorough, which is to say it was exhaustive, cross-referenced to an extent that suggested the author had been genuinely interested in the subject material and not merely fulfilling a contract, and organized with a clarity that spoke to someone who had a great deal of time and very few distractions, and who had used both well. The classification section of the report, where surveyors note their recommendation for how a given environment should be rated under colonial expansion protocols, read as follows. Harren's Reach Northern Ridge System. Atmospheric, adequate for human operators of high-altitude acclimatization profile. Supplemental oxygen non-required for Harren's deep origin personnel, and likely non-required for any human population with sustained high-altitude exposure history. Standard Earth baseline personnel would require acclimatization period and supplemental support for upper ridge sections. Thermal, within operational tolerance for standard-equipped survey work with appropriate seasonal timing. Thermal cycling is aggressive and requires careful schedule management, but is predictable once baseline is established. Terrain, technical, requires experienced route finding and good judgment. Subsurface stability is variable and requires active assessment rather than reliance on mapping data. An operator who learns the terrain can navigate it efficiently. Moderate difficulty for trained and appropriately experienced operators. Seasonal variation is significant and should govern approach windows. Recommended Colonial Survey Bureau designation. Class 4, conditional, pending further atmospheric characterization. Recommended conclave designation. Reevaluation requested. The Class 19 designation does not reflect the operational reality for appropriately adapted personnel and may be creating administrative confusion. Overall assessment note, good working ground, takes some getting used to. The Vethori Territorial Authority's classification was Class 19, unsurvivable. Her classification was Class 4, conditional. Good working ground, takes some getting used to. I filed my report. I submitted the cartographic updates, which included a substantial revision of the Northern Ridge routing data based on the lines I had observed and logged during the 8-day operation. I flagged the pending review notification from 14 months ago and submitted a formal correction request to the Office of Territorial Administration with a cover memo noting the consequences of the processing delay. I noted in my supplementary comments that the territory's environmental assessment protocols may require review in light of the updated biological data now available through the Colonial Bureau Exchange Program, and that the Class 19 designation for Harren's Reach should be considered provisional pending the completion and submission of the human surveyor's full report. Then I sat at my console in the lower orbital station, and I looked at my revised maps of Harren's Reach, which were better maps than I had started with, because an 11-month resident had left marks on the terrain that I could read if I looked closely enough. And I thought about a woman sitting on a flat rock at 12,000 units of altitude in -40 degrees, with a camp stove and a pot of tea, watching 6 of the Vethori's finest mountain specialists crest a ridge she had been using as a shortcut for 11 months, and asking if they had come far. I thought about what that question costs to ask it the way she apparently asked it, not as provocation, not as performance, as inquiry from one person who is somewhere to another person who has arrived. And I thought about this, standing there in full Summit core kit with supplemental oxygen diffusers and dynamic grip crampon systems, and 2 portable atmospheric processors, looking at a woman in standard Colonial Bureau field gear who was not visibly cold, who was making tea, who wanted to know if they had come far. I do not know what answer Vis gave. She did not tell me that part. I know she declined the tea. I have been thinking since then about what I would have said in her place, about what answer fits a moment like that. I have not found a satisfactory one. I am not certain the Vethori language contains one. The ridge is still there. She is still on it. The survey, per the Colonial Bureau's last transmitted update, is scheduled for completion in approximately 3 weeks, at which point she will pack her equipment and descend to her landing coordinates and depart. And the ridge will have been mapped by a single human surveyor working alone over 13 months, and the map will be considerably more accurate than the one I started with. I expect the conclave arbitration will be resolved before she leaves. I expect the adjudicator's finding will be what Vis said it would be in the shuttle bay on the last morning, against us. I find I do not have strong feelings about that outcome.